Nina Harper had never considered herself paranoid. In fact, she was often the voice of calm reason in high-pressure environments, which is why her consulting work in regulatory compliance was both successful and in high demand. She specialized in identifying weak points in corporate infrastructure, places where standards could slip, privacy could be breached, or loopholes could be exploited. It was ironic, then, that after years of helping others maintain integrity and protect sensitive data, she would find herself entangled in something that made her question her own sense of safety, right in the middle of her personal life. It started in the most mundane way possible, with a casual invitation from her neighborhood committee to discuss landscaping concerns. The letter was printed, politely worded, and slid under her door in a white envelope. It mentioned a few overgrown shrubs near her fence line that may be impacting the aesthetic consistency of the community, and invited her to drop by the main office during open hours. There was no formal complaint, no urgency, just a request, one she felt obligated to acknowledge. Nina lived alone, having recently moved into the suburban enclave on the city's outer edge. The neighborhood had a uniformed calmness to it, manicured lawns, neutral-colored homes, and the subtle but omnipresent culture of silent observation. It wasn't unfriendly, but it certainly wasn't welcoming either. She'd chosen the location for its proximity to the city while still offering space and quiet, a retreat after years of travel-heavy consulting. The office was located in a small building near the entrance of the development, styled to look more like a cozy reception space than an administrative center. When Nina arrived, she was greeted by a young woman with a laminated badge who smiled tightly and asked her to wait while someone became available. The lobby was quiet and immaculate, with carefully curated decor that gave the illusion of transparency and warmth. A pot of artificial orchids stood near the reception desk, and a muted security monitor played an endless loop of community highlights on the far wall. Nina sat alone, scrolling through emails on her phone, but her attention kept flickering toward the hallway to her right. Every now and then, muted voices drifted from one of the back rooms, too quiet to understand, but too present to ignore. After about 15 minutes, she was called into a mid-sized conference room with a long glass table and 4 chairs. 2 members of the neighborhood committee were already seated. They introduced themselves with firm handshakes. One was in charge of compliance, the other oversaw communications. Both wore relaxed smiles and collared shirts, the kind that were just casual enough to feel neighborly but stiff enough to remind her this was still a formal conversation. They spoke about landscaping standards, referenced shared expectations, and gently noted that her lot might need aesthetic adjustment to align with the broader vision of the neighborhood. Nina nodded politely, asked a few clarifying questions, and agreed to schedule a visit from one of their grounds assessors. Nothing about the conversation was overtly strange, and yet something didn't sit right with her. It was subtle, barely more than a feeling, but she'd learned to trust those instincts. The tone of their conversation seemed overly rehearsed, and there was a moment when one of the men looked briefly toward a bookshelf in the corner of the room after she mentioned a personal concern. It was almost imperceptible, but it made her pause. As the meeting wrapped up, she leaned down to collect her bag and caught a glimpse of something dark attached to the underside of the table. A small device, no bigger than a matchbox, half obscured by tape and shadows. She didn't react. She just left the room with a quiet "thank you," and walked out calmly, heart thrumming with a pressure she couldn't immediately define. That evening, long after she returned home and went through the motions of dinner and emails, she sat in silence on her sofa, replaying the interaction in her mind. She pulled out her laptop, did a few reverse image searches based on the brief glimpse she'd had of the device, and confirmed what she already suspected. It was an audio transmitter, commonly used for room monitoring, usually part of internal surveillance systems. She thought back to the way the committee members had engaged with her. Not hostile, not invasive, just overly curated, controlled, measured. She wasn't sure yet what it meant, but she knew it wasn't normal. And, more importantly, It wasn't right. Something was happening behind the pleasant smiles and pastel-toned emails, and if her hunch was correct, it was a lot bigger than a few shrubs on her property. The next morning, Nina awoke with the lingering discomfort of the previous day still tangled in her chest, that vague pressure that often preceded the moment when something trivial revealed itself to be part of something much larger and more insidious. She went about her routine, coffee, checking client emails, updating reports, but everything felt strangely hollow. Her mind kept returning to that small, dark device affixed under the table, the one no one had acknowledged or mentioned, the one that clearly wasn't part of the room's decorative charm. After finishing her third call of the day, she finally allowed herself to confront the growing suspicion that had been quietly feeding on her attention. She wasn't the kind of person to leap to conclusions, especially when those conclusions hinted at conspiracy, but she also wasn't the type to ignore glaring inconsistencies in controlled environments. And this neighborhood, this office, was the very definition of controlled. She revisited the community guidelines and bylaws, which she had skimmed upon moving in but never reviewed in detail. As she scrolled through the digital document, now armed with a more critical lens, she noticed something she had previously overlooked: an appendix labeled Communication Monitoring and Resident Engagement Protocols. At first glance, it read like bureaucratic filler emphasizing the community's commitment to transparent dialogue and mutual respect. But the language was vague and peppered with terms like ambient data capture, non-invasive sentiment evaluation, and feedback-enhanced engagement strategies. While none of it explicitly mentioned audio surveillance, it danced so close to the implication that Nina felt the muscles in her back tighten. She knew corporate speak better than most, and she knew when language was being used to blur a line rather than define one. The document, while lengthy, was deliberately hollow, like scaffolding around an unfinished truth. By noon, she decided to make another visit to the office, framing her return under the pretense of wanting to clarify the assessor's schedule for her landscaping review. She dressed professionally, not out of vanity, but because appearances mattered in situations where power dynamics were at play, and she needed to project competence and calm control. When she arrived, the same receptionist greeted her with the same stiff smile, though this time the woman didn't ask Nina to wait. Instead, she gestured silently for her to follow. They passed the same pristine lobby, but the vibe was different now, as though something beneath the surface had shifted. Nina was directed into a smaller room than before, one with soft lighting, pastel walls, and a single upholstered chair. It looked more like a therapist's office than anything administrative, which only heightened her sense that this interaction wasn't about landscaping at all. After a few minutes, the man who had overseen compliance during her previous visit entered the room. He didn't sit. Instead, he offered a brief nod and launched directly into an oddly impersonal monologue about ongoing community wellness audits and maintaining a consistent tone across neighborly exchanges. His words were circuitous, measured, and strangely devoid of actual meaning. Nina sat still, her eyes locked on his face, watching not only what he said but how he said it. His gaze rarely held hers, and his hands fidgeted slightly with the stylus in his right hand. She let him talk. When he finally paused, she asked a simple question. "What kind of monitoring systems are in place in your conference rooms?" His face remained neutral, but she saw something flicker, hesitation, perhaps even fear. He responded too quickly and too precisely. All community offices adhere strictly to federal and state compliance laws regarding data collection and recording. Any systems in place are fully compliant with applicable standards. The answer was a textbook non-answer, and Nina knew it. The meeting ended shortly afterward. He offered a vague promise to send her a copy of the landscaping schedule and thanked her for her commitment to neighborly excellence, a phrase that might have sounded innocuous if it weren't so deeply rehearsed. As she left the building, Nina noticed a narrow hallway off to the side, mostly hidden by a partition. Without hesitation, she veered toward it, pretending to check her phone as she passed. The hallway was dimly lit and lined with closed doors, all unmarked except one that had a keypad lock and a discreet metallic plaque that simply read, "Authorized Access Only." The door itself hummed faintly, as if powered by something larger than a standard office setup. She didn't stop, didn't slow down, but her mind captured the layout instantly. That room, she guessed, was where the real infrastructure lived. Back at home, she contacted an attorney she trusted, someone she had worked with on data privacy contracts for high-profile corporate clients. She didn't over-explain, didn't present it like a conspiracy, but laid out what she had observed and how it conflicted with local privacy laws. The attorney's response was immediate and blunt. If there was an active recording system being used in that office without visible notification or formal consent, it was potentially a violation of both state and federal law. Nina asked if she should file a complaint. The attorney's tone shifted. "Not yet. Don't tip your hand. First, you need verification. Not assumptions, not feelings. Tangible proof." That night, Nina couldn't sleep. She kept cycling through the same thoughts, the same scenarios, playing out what would happen if she escalated things too soon, or too recklessly. She understood systems. She understood how they protected themselves, how they closed ranks when threatened. Whoever was behind this operation wouldn't crumble because one resident voiced concern. She would need precision, timing, strategy, and, above all, discipline. In the following days, Nina started documenting everything. She printed copies of the bylaws, annotated them with notes, highlighted contradictions. She submitted a written request under the community's own policy structure, asking for clarification about in-office surveillance practices, citing concerns about informed consent and data retention transparency. She sent the letter via certified mail and saved multiple digital copies. No response came within the designated 5-day window. Then she noticed something strange. Small, unexplainable changes to her routine that suggested someone was monitoring her movements. A note left in her mailbox reminding her to smile more at the next meeting. A printed copy of a landscaping brochure slid under her door that included a quote she had said during her first visit to the office, something she had said while laughing, believing it was off the record. None of it was overtly threatening, but it felt like a message. "We're listening." That was the moment the reality fully settled in. This wasn't negligence. It wasn't a miscommunication or a poorly worded clause. It was a deliberate and systemic program of passive surveillance, dressed up in the language of community engagement. Nina's thoughts returned again and again to that locked room, to the humming door and the stylus fidgeting official. Whatever was happening in that building wasn't about neighborhood unity. It was about control, conditioning, and information. And Nina, whether she had intended to or not, had just become a threat to its foundation. It was around the end of the following week that the atmosphere around Nina's home began to shift from vaguely uncomfortable to undeniably invasive. Nothing dramatic happened at first, no open threats, no glaring confrontations, but a growing accumulation of off-pattern events began to disturb the rhythm of her days. She started noticing that items on her porch, which she had left in one position, would be slightly moved when she returned home. Her trash bins, normally lined up with her neighbors, would sometimes be pulled an extra foot into the driveway, though she knew she hadn't left them that way. At first, she dismissed these details as byproducts of absent-mindedness or overwork, but it was the subtle coordination of these anomalies that began to gnaw at her. The same day she received no response from the certified letter she had sent to the neighborhood office, her internet briefly cut out for 20 minutes during a private client call. A technician later confirmed that the line had been adjusted from a service panel near the edge of her lot. No one had logged the visit. No maintenance request had been made. Still, it was the kind of thing that was difficult to protest without sounding like she was spiraling. Nina understood this dynamic better than most, how institutions could bend perception until the victim seemed erratic or unreliable, especially when evidence was ephemeral or subjective. The real shift came the following Monday when Nina attempted to schedule an external home inspection, one she would pay for out of pocket. Her intent was to assess whether any unapproved equipment had been installed on her property line, perhaps camouflaged as utility infrastructure. It was a reasonable, precautionary step. And yet, the day after she made the inquiry, she received a visit from a representative of the Community Optimization Task Group, a subcommittee she had never heard of before. The man who introduced himself wore a navy windbreaker with a logo she didn't recognize, and claimed that her address had been selected for a pilot outreach initiative to assess satisfaction with shared service systems. His tone was smooth, corporate, and yet deliberately vague. He asked questions that were superficially benign: how reliable her water pressure had been lately, whether her recycling pickup was consistent, if she felt integrated into the community ecosystem. But there was a sharpness under the words, an analytic structure that betrayed his script. Nina answered with careful, neutral responses. When he left, she noted the make and model of the car he drove. Unmarked, late-model sedan, no tags identifying affiliation with any municipal body. She didn't call anyone about it. She just wrote it down. She stopped trusting normal channels. That same evening, her neighbor, a woman named Carol whom she had only spoken with briefly before, caught Nina on her way back from the mailbox and asked, in a voice that was too polite to be casual, whether Nina had had a chance to meet the neighborhood wellness officer. The phrasing immediately struck her. It was the exact terminology the man from the task group had used, word for word. Nina nodded vaguely and kept walking. Later that night, she reviewed every camera feed from her home security system, hoping to find footage of his arrival or his movements around the property. But, to her unease, she discovered a 6-hour blank space on all the recordings from that day, just static between noon and 6 p.m., covering the entire window of the encounter. She checked the system logs. The footage hadn't been deleted. It had never been recorded. Her equipment had been functioning, but its connection to the server had been manually interrupted from the outside. That confirmed what she feared. Someone had accessed her network. They hadn't done it through brute force either. Her firewall and encryption hadn't flagged a breach. They had either used administrative-level credentials or found a silent exploit that circumvented her systems entirely. It wasn't just surveillance anymore. It was tampering, and not just to observe her, but to control the narrative of her reality. That night, Nina composed a long, encrypted email to her lawyer and included everything she had gathered: the unanswered letter, the brochure with her private words printed, the unusual visit, the camera outage, the inconsistencies in bylaw, documentation. The lawyer, to his credit, responded within an hour. He told her not to speak to anyone in the neighborhood committee directly going forward, not to submit any new written inquiries until his office could prepare a formal statement of grievance, and, most importantly, to stop using her personal network. For any sensitive correspondence, she followed his instructions to the letter. He also asked her to consider relocating, temporarily, until the situation could be further investigated. But Nina refused. She wasn't running. Not yet. Not when she was this close to understanding the full scope of what was happening. 2 days later, she discovered something else. Less dramatic, but somehow more disturbing than all the previous infractions. Her community access keycard, used for entering common areas and building facilities, had been silently downgraded. When she tried to access the fitness center, a place she rarely visited but had used without issue before, the panel blinked red. A maintenance worker nearby told her the system had recently been updated to reflect engagement tiers, whatever that meant. Nina walked away without reacting. Later, she checked the community resident portal and saw that her profile now showed her as a limited access member. There had been no notice, no reason. Her role in the digital infrastructure of the neighborhood had been quietly reclassified. What disturbed her most was not that it had been done, but how easily. She began to understand that the neighborhood's systems weren't just poorly designed or overly bureaucratic, they were weaponized, adaptable, dynamic, and somewhere within those quiet hallways and keypad-locked rooms, there were people who could rewrite the boundaries of someone's existence with the push of a button. The next morning, her car wouldn't start. There was no mechanical failure, no battery issue, just a dead signal. When a local mechanic came to check it, he said the onboard system had been disabled remotely, and jokingly asked if she had a disgruntled ex who knew her login credentials. She laughed weakly and said no. But she didn't find the joke funny. It confirmed what she was beginning to accept. She wasn't being watched. She was being managed. Not with brute force or overt threats, but with subtle, surgical recalibrations of her environment, engineered to undermine her confidence, isolate her socially, and reshape her sense of what was real and what was reasonable. The escalation wasn't loud. It was calculated, strategic, psychological. And the most dangerous part, it was effective. The next 2 weeks unfolded like a carefully arranged sequence, not of chaos, but of erosion. Each day brought a new deviation, small, barely perceptible on its own, but significant in accumulation. Nina began to sense that nothing in her life was untouched anymore. Her email spam filter was inexplicably deactivated, and within hours her inbox was flooded with offers for surveillance gear and discreet residential solutions. When she contacted the support team of her email provider, they confirmed the change had been made from her own IP address at 3:12 a.m., a time when she had been asleep, phone locked, laptop shut down. Her GPS history, usually boring and repetitive, now showed pings from neighborhoods she'd never visited. In any other context, it might have looked like glitches, anomalies in a system too large to be perfectly accurate. But Nina had long since stopped believing in coincidence. The real turning point came when she received a call from someone claiming to be a regional coordination liaison, representing a new initiative to improve communication between residents and administrative infrastructure. The woman's voice was syrupy, almost artificially friendly, and the call began innocently enough. Questions about community satisfaction, digital interface usability, and neighborhood culture. But then the tone shifted. The woman asked Nina if she had any unresolved concerns, perhaps about her integration experience. Nina hesitated. The phrasing was strange. Integration was not a word typically used in housing contexts. It sounded clinical, designed. When Nina responded cautiously, the woman immediately assured her that an escalation pathway was available if she ever felt overwhelmed by environmental inconsistencies. That phrase caught Nina like a hook. It wasn't normal language. It wasn't human. It was system language, algorithmic. The woman then offered to schedule an in-person consultation with someone from their stability unit. When Nina declined, the woman didn't push, but her last sentence echoed long after the call ended. Just remember, Nina, the system's always listening for a chance to help. That night, Nina didn't sleep. Instead, she stared at the ceiling in the dark, tracing every interaction, every anomaly, trying to reconstruct the logic behind the system she was now certain was not only watching her, but actively experimenting on her behavioral responses. There was no other explanation for the measured pacing of disruptions, the manipulation of services, the carefully timed failures and digital intrusions. It wasn't surveillance. It was behavioral conditioning. Her sense of autonomy was being slowly rewritten through a series of environmental inputs, some digital, some physical, but all coordinated. She was part of a system-wide protocol, and her resistance, however passive, had likely triggered secondary scripts designed to contain or destabilize. The more she deviated, the more pressure points were activated around her life. It was no longer about observing her. It was about reshaping her. This realization didn't spark panic. It clarified everything. It reframed her decisions not as reactions, but as participation in a test. That changed the rules. She immediately ceased all non-encrypted communication, wiping her devices and isolating one offline terminal to document her observations. She began storing physical backups of critical documents off-site, not trusting her home, or any cloud system, to remain untouched. Her lawyer arranged for a third-party forensic specialist to analyze her digital trail. The results, when they came in, were both validating and terrifying. Her smart home system had been accessed through a firmware update issued under a false certificate, one that appeared legitimate but did not match the original manufacturer's signature. This kind of breach required sophistication, resources, and access to manufacturer-level infrastructure. In short, it wasn't a prank. It was institutional. Nina didn't contact the committee about this. She didn't escalate it to local authorities. She already knew the web was too wide, the layers of plausible deniability too thick. Instead, she coordinated with her attorney to prepare for an internal review hearing. Not to accuse, but to request a formal data disclosure audit, as permitted under the community's own framework. It was a procedural Trojan horse. She didn't expect transparency, but the act of requesting it would force administrative response and generate a record of resistance. But before she could submit the request, a new element entered the game. On a Monday afternoon, as she returned from a low-signal cafe where she'd been working on her offline laptop, she found a white envelope taped to her front door. It was unmarked, sealed with a simple adhesive strip. Inside was a single sheet of paper, unprinted, just a handwritten message in looping script. "You're not wrong, but don't force it. Systems are designed to swallow noise. No name, no signature, no threats, just an acknowledgement and a warning." The moment she read it, her perspective shifted again. She wasn't the only one aware of the system. Someone inside it, or close enough to it, had chosen to break protocol, to reach out. And that meant two things. First, that what she was uncovering wasn't just real, but known. Second, that someone else saw her resistance not as futile, but as dangerous. It also confirmed that her home had been physically compromised again. There were no fingerprints on the envelope, no traceable residue. Whoever delivered it had been careful, professional, probably authorized. The calm exterior of the neighborhood, the meetings about shrub heights and noise complaints, was just a skin. Underneath it, something else operated. Nina began reviewing everything with fresh eyes. She re-examined the footage from her blank security feed day and found, buried in the pre-outage frames, a partial reflection. Just enough to make out a figure standing across the street, watching the house. Not approaching, not entering. Just standing, monitoring. It wasn't just systems anymore. There were people involved, human variables, observers, possibly handlers. She pulled back even further. She began analyzing the community as an ecosystem. Patterns of movement, behavioral redundancies, cross-referencing profiles of board members with public data. It was thin, but a few anomalies surfaced. Multiple residents using identical payment processing services tied to obscure intermediary banks. Employment histories that looped back into privatized municipal consulting firms. She didn't build a case. She wasn't trying to prove a conspiracy. She was just mapping influence. The more she mapped, the more she understood that the community wasn't just a housing project. It was a closed network, a behavioral lab disguised as a residential development. And she had triggered something by failing to comply. Maybe it was her background in compliance. Maybe it was her questions. Maybe it was just the way she looked at people who lied. But something had flagged her, and now the system was tightening around her in quiet, invisible ways. She knew she couldn't trust anyone inside the neighborhood. Not the employees, not the residents, especially not the ones who smiled too easily. But she didn't feel afraid anymore. What she felt was precise, cold, focused, because now she had what they didn't want her to have: clarity. She didn't need to destroy the system. She just needed to make it expose itself, one calibrated disruption at a time. By the time the second escalation began, Nina was no longer in a state of passive reaction. The vague discomfort, the slow-building paranoia, and the calculated provocations had given way to something steadier and far more dangerous to those behind it: lucidity. She saw the mechanisms now, not just as arbitrary annoyances, but as parts of a system designed to condition behavior through pressure and attrition. She had shifted from confusion to comprehension, and that change did not go unnoticed. The first overt retaliation came 2 days after she submitted a formal internal request for audit records, targeted not at the entire committee, but focused on one specific item: the use and authorization of electronic monitoring devices within communal administrative spaces. The request was procedural, logical, and backed by language drawn directly from the residential charter. It was carefully worded to appear routine, a checkbox concern rather than a challenge to power, but she knew it would be interpreted for what it was: a test of compliance integrity. Within 48 hours, her community account portal was frozen. She couldn't log in, couldn't view neighborhood schedules or receive notifications. The tech support contact information she had used previously now led to a dead phone line. When she attempted to reset her credentials, the system denied her email as unrecognized. It was as though she had been digitally erased. At the same time, physical signs of removal began to manifest. Flyers appeared around the neighborhood bulletin boards announcing a temporary restructure of community access levels due to administrative realignment. The language was hollow, familiar, corporate camouflage for punitive action. Her visitor access privileges were also revoked. Friends who tried to enter through the main gate reported that her name no longer appeared in the directory. One was told flatly by the gate security that the resident has opted out of social integration protocols, a statement Nina had never seen, approved, or even heard before. It was a strategic isolation, not just surveillance now, but full exclusion. Still, she didn't react publicly. She maintained routine. She waved to neighbors. She ran her errands. But she watched and recorded and waited. And then, the pressure shifted from systemic to personal. It started with a smell. One morning, she opened her front door to the distinct chemical sting of bleach. At first, she thought maybe the gardeners had cleaned the sidewalk or a neighboring pet owner had overcompensated for a mess, but the odor was concentrated, dense near her doorframe, fading out as she moved down the walkway. Later that day, her indoor air purifier, normally silent, began to pulse with uneven readings. When she ran diagnostics, it registered a sudden spike in particulates, but no traceable pollutants. The unit's logs were clean, except for one strange anomaly: a timestamp at 3:47 a.m., showing a data wipe of all activity between midnight and 3:45. There had been no power outage, no scheduled update, just 3 hours of silence, erased. That night, she didn't sleep in her bedroom. She moved to the floor of her office, locked the door, and kept a non-connected thermal camera aimed at the hallway. Nothing unusual happened, but the next morning, her toothbrush, one she kept sealed in a travel case, was damp. She hadn't used it. She hadn't even opened the drawer. That was when she knew someone had been inside again. Not to vandalize, not to steal, but to infiltrate, to remind her of access, to prove control. The following day, she found the tire on her car slashed. Not blown, not shredded, but cut in a precise, straight line. No note, no confrontation, just the growing certainty that the purpose was not to damage property, but to remove comfort, disrupt stability. She reported none of this to local authorities. She knew how that script played out. Reports filed, shrugged off, quietly archived. Possibly shared. Instead, she installed mechanical deadbolts on all doors. Redundant, analog ones. She disconnected every smart device in her home, cut power to her garage opener, and began storing sensitive documents in a weatherproof lockbox buried beneath mulch in the garden. It wasn't paranoia, it was protocol. By now, her lawyer was moving ahead with filings to escalate the audit request to municipal authorities. Still procedural, still couched in official language, but now layered with evidence of systemic obstruction. The goal wasn't to accuse the system outright. It was to trigger the requirement of third-party oversight, a state-level review that could not be declined without consequence. But the moment the paperwork moved, so did the opposition. Nina returned home one evening to find an envelope in her mailbox, this time clearly official. It contained a notice of violation for non-compliance with visual uniformity codes, citing the color of her window curtains as disruptive to the community aesthetic. Attached were 2 printed photos taken from outside her home, clearly shot from an elevated angle through her second-story windows. There was no date on the photos, no timestamp, but there was no doubt they had been taken without her knowledge. She read the letter twice and then carefully set it on the table. She didn't shred it. She didn't scream. She simply photographed it, filed it, and returned to her routine. 2 nights later, the escalation reached its second threshold. At 2:17 a.m., her doorbell rang. 1 chime. Then silence. She waited, then checked the camera. Black screen. No feed. She moved quietly to the side window, lifting the corner of the blind just enough to see a figure walking slowly back down the driveway. Not hurried, not fleeing, just retreating. They didn't look back. They carried no tools, no bag, just the steady, unhurried stride of someone who wanted to be seen without offering anything to interpret. Nina didn't open the door. She didn't speak. She didn't even move until dawn. When the sun rose, she found nothing unusual. No footprints, no markings. But the lock on her mailbox had been removed. Not broken, just gone, cleanly lifted. She replaced it that afternoon with a new one. No one from the neighborhood acknowledged the activity. No one asked about it. But several days later, at a routine meeting of the community board, one she was no longer allowed to attend, a new policy was announced. Effective immediately, all correspondence involving resident grievances must be submitted exclusively through the official portal. Her access to the portal, of course, was still revoked. They weren't hiding the retaliation anymore. They were codifying it. Nina stood at the edge of her living room that night, lights off, staring at her own reflection in the window. Not to contemplate escape or revenge, but to consider the weight of what she had uncovered. This wasn't about her anymore. Not entirely. It was about precedent. About what systems do when they're threatened by the presence of a conscious, resistant variable. She hadn't fought back with fire or fists. She had followed procedure. She had asked questions. She had filed requests. And that alone had provoked the system into stripping her of status, privacy, and safety. But in doing so, it had exposed its own machinery. Too confident to remain subtle, too rigid to adapt without revealing itself. The second escalation wasn't designed to eliminate her. It was designed to make her retreat, to exhaust her resolve. And that, more than anything, told her how close she was to something real. Something they couldn't afford for her to see in full. The final rupture came with no announcement, no warning, and no possibility of turning back. Nina had known, somewhere deep in her gut, that the system watching her was capable of more than silent intimidation and coded messages. Still, when the culmination came, it bypassed the subtle and went straight to open confrontation, but in a way so meticulously orchestrated, it still managed to wear a mask of legitimacy. It began with a formal letter, hand-delivered by two uniformed men who identified themselves as representatives from the Community Oversight Response Division, a title she had never seen before, not on any documentation, not in any resident, orientation manual, or public roster. The letter, printed on thick cream-colored paper with an embossed seal, stated that due to an accumulated pattern of adversarial behavior, refusal to comply with environmental expectations, and propagation of destabilizing narratives, she was being summoned to a mandatory administrative review to evaluate her ongoing suitability for community residency. That phrase, suitability for community residency, landed in her chest like a fist. It didn't say eviction. It didn't say violation. It was something colder, more systemic, a form of bureaucratic excommunication masked in neutral language. The letter was signed, but the name was redacted with a black line, as if the document had passed through intelligence clearance. When she asked the men to identify themselves, they simply reiterated the time and location of the meeting and told her attendance was non-negotiable. Before she could ask anything else, they turned and left without further word. Her lawyer, upon reading the letter, immediately filed an injunction with the city clerk's office, citing due process violations and unlawful retaliatory action under local statutes. But that process, like everything else now, was sluggish, delayed by technical issues, and redirected to internal community jurisdiction. In other words, walled off. The day of the hearing arrived under gray skies, the kind that seemed to seal the atmosphere into a state of compression. Nina arrived exactly on time, dressed sharply, emotionless, as if attending a deposition, not a confrontation with the invisible architecture that had slowly dismantled her privacy. The hearing was held in a building she had never been allowed into before, off to the north edge of the neighborhood near the maintenance and infrastructure offices. The interior was antiseptic, lit with fluorescent panels and lined with narrow windows that offered views of blank concrete courtyards. The hearing room contained 5 people, none of them introduced, none of them named. They sat behind a long, featureless table. One of them read from a prepared script, citing policy infractions that were vague and unprovable, disruptive surveillance inquiries, excessive policy interpretation, failure to maintain consensus-based behavior. Nina wasn't given a chance to respond immediately. Instead, she was shown printed copies of what they called extracted dialogue records, phrases she had spoken in supposed private meetings, conversations recorded without her knowledge, without consent. Her words were presented stripped of context, weaponized, made to sound conspiratorial or combative. One of the board members noted that her language choices suggested a tendency toward mistrust-based frameworks. Another accused her of inviting external attention to localized matters. In that moment, Nina realized this wasn't a hearing. It was a purge, a controlled performance to justify the decision they had already made. Her lawyer had warned her not to respond emotionally, not to take the bait. And so she remained silent, listening, observing, recording every word and every omission. Then they issued their conclusion. Not an expulsion, not a fine, but a formal recommendation for psychological assessment and integration recalibration, to be scheduled at her discretion but required for continued participation in the residential. Structure. It was clinical language for something far more sinister. Either she submitted to reconditioning, or she left. Nina stood slowly, nodded once, and exited the room without a word. The hearing had not broken her. It had revealed them. Every detail had been choreographed, every term chosen to conceal authority under the pretense of community health. But they had made a mistake. They had left a procedural footprint. The existence of a recorded hearing, the names of officials withheld, the presentation of unauthorized recordings, and the issuing of a mandatory psychological review without any licensed third-party oversight. It was no longer a personal matter. It was now a legal and civil one. That night, Nina submitted every document to her attorney along with a detailed affidavit. A legal challenge was drafted, citing federal violations of privacy law, abuse of authority, and unlawful psychological coercion. Simultaneously, a request for an emergency injunction was submitted to block any enforcement actions against her pending review. But Nina knew this was not the end. This was the point of rupture. The system had exposed itself. It had declared itself. And in doing so, it had lost the shield of ambiguity. What remained now was to force it into the light, and she no longer intended to do that alone. The aftermath did not erupt in dramatic headlines or explosive confrontations, but it unraveled with the precision of a tightened knot, slowly, methodically coming apart. The injunction was granted, not because the court moved swiftly, but because the hearing transcript Nina submitted, redacted, anonymous, and featuring unauthorized recordings, raised immediate constitutional red flags. A municipal inquiry was triggered, and while the internal board attempted to bury its response beneath legal jargon and jurisdictional loopholes, the investigation widened. City oversight stepped in, then state regulators, each peeling back another layer of sanctioned misconduct that had gone unchecked for years. The language of community harmony had been used as camouflage for a surveillance apparatus operating without consent, oversight, or consequence. Nina remained in her home, never once retreating. Not because she had anything to prove, but because leaving would have validated the very mechanism designed to expel her. She did not become a crusader, did not transform into a symbol. She simply lived, present, conscious, unyielding. The psychological review they mandated never happened. Instead, several board members quietly resigned, their names disappearing from the directory. A new management body was installed, this time under full public scrutiny, their operations subject to third-party review. Policies were rewritten, legal disclaimers now stamped across every document, every meeting recorded with visible, resident-authorized equipment. But the neighborhood itself would never return to what it was. Residents, once passive, began to ask questions, not because Nina told them to, but because her presence reminded them that silence was not the same as peace. She did not win a war. She exposed a system, and in doing so, she restored a boundary more powerful than any rule or law: the right to not be watched in your own home and the right to know who is listening.